there, I'm Joey Schultz, and this is an EDHREC Quick Bite. Today, I wanted to tackle one of EDHREC's most frequently asked questions. Just what the heck is a synergy score? When you scroll through any commander's page on EDHREC, you'll see a whole bunch of numbers. First is the percentage inclusion. For instance, we can see here that Attarka World Render appears in 76% of the 12,496 Ur-Dragon decks that exist in the EDHREC database. You may notice the card next to it, Miram Sentinel Worm, also appears highly in decks, although it has a different total number. It shows up in 80% of 6,215 Ur-Dragon decks. We're often asked at EDHREC why numbers like these would be different totals, and the answer is actually pretty simple. Attarka has been around a long time, but Miram is a newer card that only came out this past year. It wasn't eligible to appear in decks 2 years ago because it didn't exist, so we don't want to measure its inclusion rate against decks that it never could have appeared in. Those 6,215 decks are the number of eligible decks that Miram could have gone into, decks that were built or updated ever since Miram was released. That helps us get an accurate percentage of how popular new cards are for older commanders. And here we can see Miram is very popular for the Ur-Dragon indeed. So that's the first figure, but then there are the numbers beneath it, the synergy score. Miram shows a synergy score of 62%. Attarka has a synergy score of 64%. But if we scroll down to the Ur-Dragon's sorceries section, for instance, we'll see cards like Cultivate and Kodama's Reach that have much lower synergy scores, 9% and 11%. Why are these so much lower? Why do they have different synergy scores? Or, hey, Rampant Growth over here has a synergy score of 0. Does that mean EDHREC is saying these cards are bad in an Ur-Dragon deck? What does all this mean? Don't worry, it's actually very simple. I find it's most helpful to think of the synergy scores as a uniqueness factor. How unique are those cards to this particular commander, or are those cards actually very common in EDH decks overall? What the synergy score on EDHREC tracks is how often those particular cards appear in this specific commander compared to how often those cards appear in other commander decks of the same color identity. So to go back to all the examples, here's how it's all calculated. Cultivate appears in 52% of the 12,000 Ur-Dragon decks, but Cultivate also appears in 43% of all 5-color decks. Kenrith, Joda, Ramos, all those folks. 52 minus 43 comes out to 9. Cultivate is only slightly more unique in the Ur-Dragon decks than in other 5-color decks. And we can check up on stuff like this with the staples pages too. Farther down on the EDHREC color identity pages, we have a list of staples, the most common cards that appear in decks of those color combinations. So for instance here, we can see Cultivate showing up on average in 43% of all 5-color decks, or Swords to Plowshares showing up in 37% of all 5-color decks. These cards are ubiquitous, powerful, in high demand by lots of players, and that's why the Ur-Dragon doesn't have any of them as high synergy cards. They're great cards, they just don't provide a unique synergy to the Ur-Dragon in particular. Rampant Growth had a synergy score of 0% for the Ur-Dragon because it's just as common in Ur-Dragon decks as it is in all 5-color decks. So let's go back to our other big example. Attarka appears in 76% of the 12,000 Ur-Dragon decks, and Attarka also happens to appear in an average of 12% of all 5-color decks. I imagine decks like Cody or Slivers don't play Attarka at all, but some other decks like Tiamat do play Attarka. So the play rates amongst all those other commanders all averages out to the 12% inclusion rate for Attarka in all 5-color decks. From there, it's easy math. That 76 minus the 12 is what gives Attarka the 64% synergy score in the Ur-Dragon decks, and that is what places it in the high synergy section of the Ur-Dragon's EDHREC page. This card is so much more common in this commander deck, but it's not nearly as common in other commander decks of the same colors. And when looking over all that data, that there is a sign to us that deck builders have found this card a noteworthy inclusion here in this specific deck. Synergy scores are not the end-all be-all or a value judgment on any cards, they're just simple math, and they're a nice way to notice if a card offers something to this particular commander deck that stands out from all the others. And there we are. I hope you've enjoyed this EDHREC Quick Bite, and let us know in the comments if there are any other FAQs that you'd like us to tackle in the future. But until then, remember to EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.